Welcome to a special edition of The Buck Stops Here, the official audio and video show of NotHallOfFame.com. And I've got with me someone who's been part of a lot of the processes that we've been doing for our mock Pro Football Hall of Fame committees, Paul Lawrence, and a fellow Canadian. How the hell did we meet through football when neither of us are living in Canada at this point?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, right? It is really sort of a universal global game that you watch as a kid, you move around all the rest of your life, and you end up in all kinds of places, but you still have this NFL connection.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about doing this because we've spoken quite a few times, but we've never actually had a one-on-one. So just now, for the first time, I'm learning from your background, you're a Cowboys fan. I had no idea. How does that come about growing up in Canada?
So I grew up in a small town in southern Ontario in Canada. My dad was a sports fan, and he would sit and watch football games. And my earliest memories, I'm sure we did it before then, but the earliest memory I can have is watching Super Bowl 12 with my dad as a kid. That was the Tom Landry era with Roger Staubach and Tony Dorsett, Randy White, and the Doomsday Defense. And that's how I got hooked. And over the years since then, I followed the Cowboys all the way through, of course, the few years that were left in Staubach's career, to Danny White taking him to 3 consecutive NFC championship games in the 80s. In the low years, the Herschel Walker pickup and trade, and then, of course, Jerry Jones and the triplets and all of that. So, yeah, I've been a pretty consistent fan of the Cowboys since 1977.
We're in southern Ontario. I'm from Burlington.
So I grew up in a small town south of London, Ontario.
Which one?
St. Thomas.
Yeah, I know St. Thomas. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
That's where I'm from originally. And I've been living here in Ohio now for about 20 years. I got a professional opportunity and a job and moved down here and been here ever since. But yeah, my interest with the NFL and the Cowboys, goes back decades before that. And it's kind of funny being a Canadian.
Yeah.
My uncle actually is big. My uncle's a big CFL fan, actually a season ticket holder for many, many years for the Hamilton Tiger Cats.
Right.
But I never, because my dad's interest, we never sort of got connected into the whole CFL culture, which is a big thing for a lot of communities in Canada. And it was really just, NFL was on TV, all the games were TV, the Cowboys were on TV all the time. And so that's that kind of connection.
It's funny you bring that up, and I'll just bring up one of our associates, Vinny Laspinosa, who is part of our group. And I'm going to do a shameless plug. Vinny has a regular show with me where Vinny makes the Hall of Fame case for, sometimes for people I've never heard the hell of. But he does a great job, and I love the kid. And I have to say kid because I'm going to be 50. He's 21, 22. So we talk. He always asks me about my fandom of NFL, but it sounds like you and I have sort of that similar upbringing because when you and I were growing up, right? So we would have that one game a week, and usually it was the NFC East. I mean, that's I just remember that from as a kid. Usually Dallas would be on a regular basis, or be Washington, or be the Giants, or any combination thereof. Usually one of those three teams, that would be a 50-50 shot of them being on regular TV. Man, that makes me feel old, especially as I watch the NFL Network and all that, and the Red Zone. And just...
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it was back in that era. And I mean, I live in a town where we sort of were in the Cleveland Browns TV market, somewhat Detroit Lions.
Really?
But
okay.
Yeah, but you have to remember, this is the 70s and 80s, which for those franchises, with a few exceptions of the Browns there, they weren't really, drawing national media attention. So, on a regular Sunday afternoon, you might pick up a game like that occasionally. But you're right, because of the market and, the Cowboys being, America's team, they were on TV a lot on Sundays. And of course, back then, Monday night was your only other alternative. And then they were always in the playoffs, right? That team went to the playoffs so many years from the late 60s into the mid 1980s that they were a relatively easy team to follow because they were in the news, they were on TV, very popular players. I mean, they were sort of, the NFL PR machine was just sort of pushing them out. And I think it's the reason why America's team across the US and the world really grew, because of, they were marketing, and the exposure of that team really had a broad reach, and they won, and they were on TV, and that really drew fans to them, which is much different than it is today, where you could be living in Tokyo, Japan, and be a Bears fan, right? Because you get the media exposure and TV is so universal across the season. Games on, Sundays, Saturdays, Mondays, Thanksgiving, Thursday, it's just the market saturation now is so global and throughout the entire season that, you're creating fans of all kinds of shapes. But that wasn't the case in the 70s and 80s.
No, it certainly wasn't. So how does your fandom then translate to a love of the Hall of Fame?
So I actually went to the Hall of Fame in 1994 for the first time on a trip with my wife. And we saw Randy White, Tony Dorsett were enshrined the same ceremony back when it used to be a small group of people outside the steps of the front of the hall. I mean, several hundred people. And that was my first opportunity. And because of this sort of connection with the Cowboys in the 70s and 80s, right, I've always wanted to kind of make that trip to the shrine of the Hall of Fame. And 2 players were being inducted from the same team from that era at the same time. And so that kind of started my interest in kind of following it. And then also that was a time in which, prior to that, there really wasn't a lot of, reporting or news behind the scenes about the Hall of Fame and the process, the players. And when that started to develop in the 90s with the internet and folks like the late Paul Zimmerman, who reported for Sports Illustrated, and then Peter King, they would often start to give them more insight. And of course, that expanded into the web influence and then later, of course, with the internet and blogs and podcasts and all of that. So at the time, it was interesting just to dig in and find out a little bit more. It got easier as more and more of those sort of tidbits and the process. We still don't know a lot, but you could start to understand a little more about who's involved, what the steps are, what does it mean to be a finalist? How does that work? I just sort of got intrigued because beyond the Cowboys, I'm interested in NFL history and the league, and it kind of tied in nicely. So it was really the combination of more Cowboys being considered for the Hall in the 90s and early 2000s, and much more, I guess, access to the process to some degree and familiarity with it. And that led me to follow it a lot closer. I've been to the Hall several other times. I've been to other enshrinements. And then more recently sort of got engaged in Twitter and social media, just sort of, informing, educating, following, and meeting groups like yourself and others. Right. There's much more discussion and access to information and people talking about the Hall now than there was even 10 years ago.
So actually, I want to make sure that I get that plug out there. What's your social media handle for people to follow you? Which you can tell you're into this from your Twitter.
Yeah, so I changed a couple of times, but I think it's now.
Yeah, it's like if I ask your phone number, well, I just know it. Just call me.
I think it's Pro Football Hall Canton Guy. I think that's what I go by. Just sort of generic, and I always, preface that with I don't work for the Hall. I don't represent the Hall. I'm just a guy who has an interest, and I share that on social media with fans and others, and exchange information, ideas, and just sort of network on that. I have some insight, but I don't profess. I'm not a voter. I don't work for the Hall.
Well, not yet.
What I glean from other sources and people about what's going on, who's talking about this, what candidates are getting buzzed, and then fans are constantly out there like, Jim Plunkett should be in the Hall of Fame. Now the Raiders fan would do that, and then I try to be nice about it. I'm kind of pointing out, it's a high bar to reach. This is the sort of criteria people look for. He's a great guy. Yes, he won 2 Super Bowls, but frankly, Lester Hayes is probably a better candidate from that era than Jim Plunkett is. And by the way, they're in this deep senior pool of a lot of candidates who are very deserving. So I try to be sort of information exchange, networking, and share what I know from folks. I'm not consider myself an insider as much as I just sort of follow, the waves of information and help share and distribute some of that across to groups.
Yeah, just reading the tea leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, well, like one of my big things when I look at Halls of Fame, because I look at like not just this one, also baseball, hockey, basketball, whatnot. One thing I think hockey and baseball got right is they put their Hall of Fame early, which is sort of why when I feel that when the Hockey Hall of Fame said, it bothered me, but it didn't bother me that much that due to COVID, they were not going to have a ceremony this year. It's like, okay, well, who are we really snubbing? Not really anybody. That's actually my reminder to call you. So So it wasn't that bad because they started, I believe, it was 40s or 30s. I can't remember. Baseball started in the 30s. So we're not looking at this giant backlog. You and I, we have our little group that we have our discussions, and we're both of the belief, and I think a lot of people who are watching this would agree that because they got such a late start, the backlog is, whatever word I use, astronomical, gigantic. There's no great word for this. It's just huge. So what do you see as the biggest thing that they've done wrong? Because I think they've done a lot right personally, and we'll get there, but like, what is the biggest egregious thing to you? Because that's what it is to me. And I'm curious if you would agree with me on that.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. I mean, the hall opened in 1963. That was 40 years after, over 40 years after the league was founded. So
right.
From the get-go, they've sort of been behind on a catch-up of decades of players. Now, granted, the early large class in 63 and then efforts in the 60s and 70s helped them catch up. But what happened is a lot of guys sort of got pushed to the wayside as you get into the 70s and 80s. Newer guys would come on the ballot, and this legacy sort of spiraled into what I refer to as the deep pool of senior candidates. And that's a real struggle I think the hall is still trying to rectify. And it's one that sort of built up from that legacy, but also if you look at the classes, the modern classes that were enshrined in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the early 2000s, there were classes where they could have filled 6 or 7 slots under the various rules at the time. Right. There are classes there with as few as 3 or 4 players, even in the early 2000s. And so the committee was very, in the 70s, 80s is different than it is today. They were really, I think, more of a small hall exclusive kind of thought to it. But what resulted is some really great deserving players, from the 70s way back the 1920s, have never even been in front of the committee to be discussed, let alone have opportunity to be voted on. And so there is this big backlog. In terms of the modern candidates that most people associate with hall elections, I mean, we can quibble every year, like this year, right, about the 5 modern that were selected. But I think if you look at the time frame, you look at people becoming semifinalists and finalists, like the last 20 years, almost all of those guys get in. It may take somebody 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and a couple players even longer, but they get it right. And we can argue over the order, and but reality is, yeah, we do, which is a great fun argument to have, right? It's kind of like, is this guy more deserving than this? And it's all subjective, right? I mean, there are numbers and stats and analytics, but at the end of the day, these are 49 voters making a subjective decision based on their own opinions, which they have a right to, and this is the outcome. So I think the modern process does well. I think the committee most years gets it right. And if we think they don't, they're going to catch up. The senior is where we have the real issue, where they've cut back from a few years ago. For several years, it was 2 a year, then they went to 1. Now there is discussion of getting it back to 2 seniors a year, because by people's measure, that senior pool legitimately could be 50 to 100 guys. And I'm not saying that all are going to get in the hall, but when you're looking at a pool that big and you can only bring in 1 person a year as a senior candidate, as a player, and now that we have separate categories for coaches and contributors, that actually helps the senior players a little bit. It's a real sort of big pit. And I know the halls recognizes it a problem. The new president does, the voters do. But I see that as a real challenge, because there's a number of very deserving seniors that are in their 70s and their 80s. And it's terrible, unfortunate when it happens to folks like Cliff Branch and Kenny Stabler, that they don't live to see that honor. And hopefully we can move forward to get more seniors in and get that pool thinned out. Because I think there's an opportunity there, and the hall and the voters know it's a problem. So let's see if we can get that fixed.
Okay. So on a personal level, who has been the person you've been most happy to see get in?
Well, this is kind of an interesting story, because I didn't really know him as a player. I knew of him. But when I started looking at the Cowboys, particularly from the Landry era. So in 2000, what people need to remember is there were only a handful of Cowboys players in the Hall of Fame at that time. You know, there was the one names people associate with, right? So there was Staubach and Bob Lilly, Randy White, Tweedy Dorsett. Mel Renfro waited to the last year as a modern candidate and finally got on the ballot and got elected in, I think, 1996. But there were a whole bunch of players from that era that were deserving, and guys like Drew Pearson and Cliff Harris and Rayfield Wright and Bob Hayes, among others. And so in the early 2000s, it was like, well, these guys are coming up. Some of them were using up the last year of their eligibility as a modern. We're going to fall into this huge, deep seniors pool. And that's kind of what I started focusing on, is what is going on. And I think it was in 2004, there were actually 3 Cowboys as finalists that one year. Cliff Harris, his first year on the ballot, never got elected, fell into the seniors pool. Rayfield Wright was last year, I believe, as a modern, and Bob Hayes was the senior finalist that year. When they cut down to 5, which is the last stage, you need to get 80% of the votes of the 5. Those 2 made it to that stage and were not elected. 3 other moderns and one other senior made that class. And of course, I was following the late Paul Zimmer, Dr. Z, who wrote extensively and was a voter for many, many years.
Great man. Great man.
Yeah, many consider him one of the best football historian writers of all time, even though he's passed away a number of years ago.
Yeah.
He wrote an article after that vote, and he was livid. And he said, you know, the expression you use is the assassins came out from nowhere with their knives, which what he was referring to was at that last stage, normally you have 5 finalists, you need 80%. Everyone's done all their work to get to the point, that's the 5, you elect the 5. And he was so outraged about Bob Hayes because he said there was no negative debate. They were silent, and yet they didn't vote for him. He resigned from the senior committee. He continued to serve as a regular voter. And he wrote a very scathing article about how that process needs to be fair and equitable. And you have a seniors committee, right? They pick these guys, they do their work, they nominate them. In that case, it was 2 a year. And that should be respected. And it wasn't. And I felt really bad. Bob Hayes had actually passed away in 2001. But his family was obviously, very supportive and wanted to see him elected. Fortunately, in 2009, the senior committee put his name in again as a second time, and he was elected. Mm-hmm. So that case sort of resonated with me. And the other one and then going on from that, the one guy that I really thought all these years when I mentioned these Cowboys from the 70s, who I thought this guy is going to get elected. And yet everybody else, including Gil Brandt, has been elected from that era. And they're all fine. I have no problem. But Chuck Howley still sits out there. One of the best linebackers not in the Hall of Fame. This guy, 5-time first team All-Pro consensus, right? 5 Pro Bowls. He was the MVP of Super Bowl 5 as a defensive player on the losing team.
Yes.
And then a year later, in Super Bowl 6, which they won, he was the best defensive player in that game. He's never been a finalist. He's never been a senior finalist or a modern finalist. He was just one of these guys that was just washed away off the ballot. It's not an all-decade. And in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of great linebackers, and he was just like Tommy Nobles from Atlanta, same kind of era. He also was kind of pushed into that area. And so my passion right now, and I know the voters are aware of it, Chuck Howley has been considered as a senior finalist when they get it down to about a dozen or 15. He's been in that list. We don't know that list every year. We don't see it, but rumors come out. You kind of see it. I kind of parceled it together for some years. The voters are well aware of him. Rick Goslin, a longtime writer for the Dallas Morning News, who is now retired but does online reporting. He is still a voter. He's on the senior committee. He's advocating for his case. But it's just really unfortunate because he's one of these guys that's in this deep senior pool. He's in his mid-80s. His health isn't great. And yet it would be a terrible thing to see him pass away before having this opportunity, when I think there's general agreement among many people, including voters, that he's deserving. And so we need to get him in.
And I think we've seen cases where voters don't want to be sort of like pushed in what to think, even though they know it's the right thing to do. I think I'm going back to the Hockey Hall of Fame. Pat Burns comes to mind, who got in. We knew he was dying, and they didn't vote him in that year. They voted him in 2 years later. It's almost like, well, don't tell us what to do. I mean, I got that vibe, and I don't know where I get it from, because like, there's literally no transparency in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Although I praised them earlier. Then I think of Chubby Checker in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, who says, "Well, what good is putting me in when I'm dead?"
No, I mean, it's a difficult situation, difficult aspect of this, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I've had some email interaction with a few voters over the year. Again, I don't consider myself their friends or their colleagues or anything.
Mhm.
And you do certainly get a sense that they're very sensitive. Some of them are actually a little bit sort of aggressive against push from fans. They get a lot of emails, they get letter writing campaigns, and
Right.
they get kind of fed up with it. In this era of social media, for the voters who are on social media,
Mhm.
they're careful about what they're posting. They're careful. Some of them will respond, but they're not very receptive. And this is one issue that I think is a sensitive one for everyone. I think they recognize and realize this issue of, players getting older and let's get them elected, but they don't want to use that as a measuring stick or a justification for whether somebody should be advanced over someone else. They really stick to this mantra: is we need to put forth, in the case of the senior finalist, the best candidate that we feel that is necessary. But when you're dealing with a short list of 12 or 15 names every year that are in front of a rotating group of 5 voters, that's who makes that selection in August, that then goes to full committee. And in the last 20 years, the vast majority of senior finalists are elected. It's a fine line between a guy like Chuck Howley or Randy Gradishar or Drew Pearson or Cliff Branch. And once the senior finalist is picked, I don't have begrudge anybody, and I'm not gonna, because I realize how difficult it is, and it's coming from those names of deserving. But it is sort of every year is a little bit of a kind of like a deep frustration to say, I'm great. I'm happy for guys like Cliff Harris, and who got in the Centennial class route through the seniors,
Right.
and guys like Cliff Branch and others. That's great. It's great for them. They're deserving. I don't want to dismiss that. It's just,
Mhm.
you look at that list and you go, Josh Garnett, Chuck Howley, Randy Gradishar is another guy that
So
should be in, and I'm hoping in the next few years his case gets to the
yeah.
point where he's there. So again, he's another one that voters are aware of, has a strong case.
Mhm.
We just got to figure out, and hopefully an increase from the 1 to 2 seniors, which is being talked about, will double that process of getting this pool, especially the top 10 or 20, really quickly dealt with.
Yeah, I had a great chance to talk to a gentleman named Ron Katz, who was the Broncos Fan of the Year, and he made this great case for Randy Gradishar. Would it be safe to say, because we've talked a lot about the Cowboys, would Gradishar be the non-Cowboy that you're most passionate about for getting into the Pro
Yeah,
Football?
I mean, he's certainly up there because I've heard the case made for him for many, many years. I know he has a lot of support, obviously from the fan base, but from writers and others who look at the hall and the voters. So when you see somebody like that is in the mix, right, among these, let's say 12 or so, and he's been in that mix for several years, like Howley, you
Mhm.
sort of cheer for them, right? It's like they're there, they just need to take that one more step, and they've been there for so many years. Yeah, you really, I personally feel for guys like that. And there's other names that I know are in there, guys like Joe Klecko and Roger Craig. We
Oh, I love
mentioned
Craig.
Tommy Nobilis. I mean, they're there. There's also players that were in the Centennial class as finalists, as seniors. Um,
Right.
Ludwig Dalwig is another guy that gets a lot of interest, early Packers receiver, excuse me. So
Oh,
there's a mix of guys
Vinny's
in
ears
there.
are tingling right now.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there are probably 10, 12 guys that this year, if they select 1 or 2, if it comes from that 12, I'm going to go, that's fantastic. I
Right.
would have maybe my preferences for Howley or Gradishar, but that's where we're at. There's really, in my view, a top tier of maybe 12 or 15 who really need to get in. And slowly we're seeing some of them. I think the seniors committee in the last several years has done fairly well. I think the Centennial class, out of 10, 7 or 8 were pretty good. There were a couple that we would debate. But we're getting there.
Right.
Just to see these 12 guys or so finally reach that pinnacle, because we know they're not coming out of nowhere, that they're deserving. We just the numbers are against them in terms of only electing 1 a year. It just takes time.
Yeah, here's something I'd like to ask you. Like, you've been part of our pro football mock committee for the last, well, 2 years. We've only done it 2 years. So from year one, it was in the embryonic state. I'm just seeing how many people I can get. Year two was certainly, we had different voices, which made it a lot different. So our results in year two were very different from year one. And I'm hoping that in year three, when we do this, we're going to have some new people on that from different voices, different fan bases, different genders. I don't have a woman in this group. So if you're a female and you want to be part of this group, please, we would love to have you. Because we want to get different voices for that. And the reason I bring that up is I think do you think, and this is just something I've thought about recently, with the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the voters, should there maybe be term limits? Because different people will come up with different points of view. And with no disrespect to some of the people who are on it, who I've got mad respect for, once you've got a view, it's pretty hard. And I have to say this from personal experience, to change my mind. I try to be as open-minded as possible, but I'm going to be 50, man. It's getting harder and harder for that. Like, what do you think?
I think that's a fair question to have. You know, these are basically lifetime appointments as long as you're in the profession. If you choose to resign or retire, that will happen. And there has been, I mean, I tell people all the time when they complain about the voting in the hall over decades, I'm like, you have to realize the committee in 1984 and the committee in 2002 and the committee in 2022 are completely different. They've expanded the number of voters. They've had new voices. They've increased the diversity and representation. I mean, we're now up to 49. I think they want to get to 50 voters from 48. But back in the early days, 70s and 90s, that number was, I think, 36 or 38 voters, and then they gradually added to it. And so I think there's an awareness on behalf of the hall, the board of directors, and the president, is that new, fresh voices are necessary. And that you raise a good point does that also mean we need to be thinking about a term limit? Some people argue, well, listen, there's only so many people who follow the game as writers. These are largely writers or in the media.
Yeah.
But I think there are also others, historians and some others, that could be put on to that. You know, we have 3 current Hall of Famers as voters, but they're also all members essentially of the media, journalists on TV and whatnot. But so, yeah, I think that's a good point, is you get set in these mindsets of I'm going to support this player or I'm not going to support them. And if you get entrenched and your view doesn't change for decades, one person can't keep somebody out of the hall, but one person among others and having influence, and does that spiral into changing other folks' minds? I mean, yes. So in terms of diversity and having fresh views, maybe setting some type of reasonable term limit. Maybe you rotate in, and I've served on board of directors in situations like this where you serve a couple terms, you have to sit out a term, and then you come back in.
Oh, I like that. Okay. Yeah.
That kind of idea, maybe you serve for 10 years, you have to sit out for 5 years, and then you can come back in the pool. I mean, some model like that would at least mean, and you wouldn't rotate huge groups out. Maybe you rotate out a quarter of the third of the voters, on a regular cycle. So you've got a history and legacy there, but then you bring in fresh voters, and then you rotate people in. So maybe you create a pool, I don't know, hypothetically of 80 people, and then you rotate in 50 on some kind of like one quarter or 1/3 of the voters would rotate in or out every election or every couple of years. Because that will break up maybe some stalemate and some positioning, and as the game goes on, we get more and more recent in the sense that we're now looking at players from the 2000s, more and more media expertise on that, and you still have the legacy guys who can talk about and remember players. I mean, there's some voters in there that covered the game in the 70s and early 80s, so that's helpful. But to expand that perspective and view, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah. One thing Vinny and I have talked about, he's probably talked about that with you. I just realized it sounded very Canadian. Talk to Boot. is having, when we look at the senior groups, having different geographic, historical periods. Would that be something that, and that's something that I would sort of like to see maybe instituted for a few years, where you've got one group from, like, let's say 1920 to 1950, and then 50 to, or maybe 1920 to 1940, or to pre-AAFC, then 45 to AFL, an AFL group, and then just sort of like that, and just sort of like have that, and just try to, I don't know, just sort of like take the skimmer through the pool, if that makes any sense. Like one big thing.
No, I get where you're going with that, because you're right. When you look at, when we talk about the depth of the senior pool, people might say, well, is that just a bunch of guys from the 70s and 80s who just haven't worked through the system, and their modern eligibility, has sort of waned and they fall in? Well, there are those, and we've mentioned several of the names, but there's also a large number of these guys who are actually pre-1960. The hall was established in 1963. We talked about this earlier. There's a backlog of guys who are never considered. And so it would be interesting to think about models. Now, the Centennial class, proposed by Rich Gazan, actually one of the voters, pushed and advocated for that idea to get more of these seniors in. But it helped, but it didn't, because the committee decided to sprinkle their selections of the 10 seniors who were put into the Centennial class from decades all the way into the 80s. For whatever reason, they wanted representation across the history of the league. Okay, fair enough. But there were actually very few from that pre-1960, or if you want to think pre-Super Bowl era. That NFL history is almost half and half, pre-post NFL. So I think there is a time to think about, how do we deal with those individuals? That's one model. The other thought that I've had, and I don't know when and if this would happen, because we just had the large Centennial class in 2020, is, maybe with the 70th or 75th anniversary of the forming of the hall itself, you take that one pause and you say, we're going to do, one capture, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 12, whatever the number is, of players, coaches, and contributors pre-1960. And this is we're going to skim all that off. This is going to be our final attempt. Sort of, you think back to what the Baseball Hall of Fame did a number of years ago, to try to represent, the Negro leagues that were poorly represented. They did a large special class to capture a lot of those individuals. And of course, now they have a regular cycle of committees that are including that era.
Buck O'Neill got in, yes.
So that's, this is a model of having, an early, I don't know what you might want to call it, early NFL, history kind of class. And when you talk to folks, because that era, there's very little film. It's all on paper, right? It's just anecdotes, stories. The stats are kind of all over the place. It's a totally different game. But I think if you had a collection, not necessarily of voters, put a committee together of 10 of the best historians of pro football out there. They don't need to be writers. Maybe a few of them are. And then you charge those 10 people to come up with a master list, and then call that down. And that group says, here are the 10 or 12, and you elect them.
We know an early 20-something who would do that. But anyway.
So yeah, but you're right. Because if that isn't done at some point, whether it's these subclasses or a special class, more seniors get in the pool every year, right? We're going to get the guys from the 80s falling into senior. That's already happening. And so the further you go back, guys in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and there are several of them that will come up at the top of anybody's list, they're just going to find it harder and harder. And the senior committee, isn't necessarily going to be focusing on them, because they're going to, some of them have that background, but they're also looking at guys that they covered and know, like a Randy Gradishar and a Roger Craig. And those are the kind of guys from the 80s that are now falling into the senior pool. And that's only going to increase. And we're going to forget about the pre-60 guys if we're not careful.
Yeah, I'm huge on Roger Craig personally, not necessarily because if you just look at his stats, it doesn't seem like it's that special. But there was no Roger Craig then. And when I look at Devin Hester, like right now, Hester, to me, and I was happy to see him be a finalist. I didn't think he would. I really didn't. And he's going to be the last guy that we remember who you altered your entire game around him as a returner. So Craig to me was that type of guy, and I don't know how he slipped through, but so be it.
Well, I think Roger Craig is sort of the classic scenario of a senior, right? Because historically, he was unique for his time. His career was unique in the kind of player he was and the contributions he made to a championship team.
Right.
But I think he falls behind the cracks because, again, if you think of the context of when he was a modern candidate, as a running back, he's up against these big name running backs from his era, the Eric Dickersons and the Tony Dorsetts, and then you go through the list in the 80s and 90s, who put up multiple 1,000-yard rushing seasons with 10 rushing touchdowns. Some of them like an Emmitt Smith or Ternell Davis, huge playoff running statistics, touchdowns, championships. And I think he just sort of gets lost in that mix because the voters are looking at these career numbers, season numbers, and in terms of awards or accomplishments, yeah, Super Bowls he certainly has. But we look at things like the all-decade teams, all-pro. He just doesn't match up very well in that sense against the peers of his time. By peers, I mean other running backs. Mm-hmm. And as a result, his case just sort of gets shuffled to the side. And then all of a sudden, somebody wakes up one day and realizes, oh, he's in the senior pool with these 50 or other 100 guys. Good luck getting out of there. But we do know, again, he is a name that the senior committee has considered. So we do know that he's in that mix. And I know it isn't very helpful when you're in that list year after year and you're in that 10 or 12. But heck, I'd rather be in the 10 or 12 than be one of the other 50 or plus guys whose name just isn't on anybody's radar on the senior committee. So I'm optimistic that Craig, as we begin to look at seniors from that era and they go back and look at who was missed, his case is strong enough that, he could have been in the Centennial class. That's from the 80s. Yeah. He would have been a great representative of that era. I think much better than Jim Covert, but you can argue the Bears fans on that one. So he's there. And he's just a classic guy who falls into a senior pool that's sort of forgotten about. And then all of a sudden we need to get him out because he is certainly deserving. I think his career at the time, the game was evolving. Now we look back and realize the model that he was setting of this type of running back who also had 1,000-yard reception season and brought in, there were other running backs, Chuck Foreman in the 70s who was a receiver, but the game changed, and yet the view of running backs and how voters view those candidates kind of lags, by years or maybe decade. And then I say, he just sort of forgotten.
Mm-hmm. So just to close off, if I could, I put this to our group, and you helped out with that. I'm pretty sure you did. Eligible for 2023 is a group of 6 players that I'm just going to mention here. Joe Thomas, Darrelle Revis, Shane Leckler, Jari Evans, James Harrison, Dwight Freeney. That's 6 people who are going to be eligible in 2023 who could be, all of them probably might be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Thomas for sure. Not sure about the other 5. Well, Thomas and Revis for sure, I think. That's a Hall of Fame class right there in itself. That doesn't take into account all the others who are still eligible. If that doesn't tell you how hard it is to get into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I don't know what does. So when I hear comments from Deion Sanders, sometimes like the bar so low, really? Deion, I love you, but
yeah.
And I love Deion, but
I think a lot of folks who have maybe a casual or limited exposure interest to the Hall, they have these perceptions of the process and the bar and how exclusive it is. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't always mirror reality, right? So by the best numbers we have in the history of the NFL from its inception, say to a decade ago, you're looking at players, coaches, contributors, administrators, maybe less than 2% are in the Hall of Fame. If you look at it kind of by decade, and of course, we're still working through the 90s and 2000s, but if you go back and look at the league in the 60s and 70s, again, the percentage of people who played during those decades who actually got in the Hall is really small, under 5% easily. So by my view, that is still selective. It's a big league. There's a lot of teams. The rosters are a large number of starters. So there are a lot of folks involved with the game. So hence the number is going to be bigger, but the percentage is still relatively low. And I think people look at that. And when I hear Dion is Dion, my first response is Dion isn't really concerned about how many people are being put in the Hall. He is critical of an individual and doesn't think they met some standard that he has in mind about who is a Hall of Famer. And I'll say this to Dion and other folks. When you're elected to the Hall of Fame, it is an honor given to you by a committee of the Hall. You don't own the key to who else joins you, who's in there, who comes in the future. You should be thanking and welcoming, and by the vast majority of Hall of Famers, bring in new Hall of Famers as part of their fraternity and family. You see that at the enshrinement, you see that in the various events. They really see themselves as a club, and they bring the new members in and treat them as equal. If you're a Hall of Famer, you're a Hall of Famer. How long you got there, the process, what your credentials were, doesn't matter. You're in. And I get a little bit upset when current or probably future Hall of Famers or players or others take kind of pot shots at a class and who gets elected, because I don't think that's fair. Once you're in, you're in. And you know, Dion was given the honor, but that doesn't mean he can stand at the door and tell people, well, your case isn't good enough, or we're letting too many in. Sorry, only 4 of you get in this year. The rest of you have to come. No, I'm sorry. Hall of Famers don't get that privilege.
So some people in an elite club like to keep it elite.
Yes, and I understand a little bit of mentality. If you're going to create your own elite club, you can invite whoever you want. But the Hall of Famers, that's not their. They haven't created the club. They're not the ones who are the gatekeepers of it. There's a legacy there and a process in the Hall, and the voters who are given that responsibility, whether we agree or disagree with the outcomes. Fan bases being critical, I get it. Members of the media who aren't in the process being critical, fine. Where I draw the line is if you are a current player or former player, a current or possibly future Hall of Famer, every time you hear somebody's in the Hall of Fame, you should say congratulations to them and leave it at that.
Nice. That's my view. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end this. This is usually where I do some blatant self-promotion. Hey, Paul, I wrote a book. Buy my book. Chavo Guerrero. Instant classic. You can get that on Amazon.com. Check that out. I've got the weekly show with Evan Nolan. Him and I, we sort of look at the latest Hall of Fame stuff. I'm probably going to be crapping on the Olympics again. 3rd week in a row.
Uh-oh.
Oh, the Olympics are terrible.
You want to give us a little preview of that?
Yeah, I'll give it right now. Yeah, comic book guy. Worst Olympics ever. More or less. That's kind of where I'm sort of going with that. So I'm going to be dumping on that. And it'll be our regular segments where we look at elevator up, elevator down, who has made their greatest Hall of Fame case. I've got another show coming out pretty soon where, hey, who went #1? We look at past #1s. Tonight, after this, I'm recording Cher's Half-Breed. Remember that one, Paul?
Whoa, now you're deep. You're digging deep back there.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we're digging deep. So we're going to be looking at myself, Andrea Tessman, and Brad Nelson. We're going to look at how this song went #1 on a show called How the Hell Did This Go #1? And a couple weeks from now, in This Crap Was on National Television, Chris Burdett and I, we're going to look at that 80s show that never should have went on. And if
you guys have your hands full, there's a lot you could run with some of those themes. Boy,
oh my God, yes. And for all those who are tired of looking at me in this network, is this a network? No, I'll say it's a network. Well, sorry. I'm hoping I can get someone else to host some of this shit, but no one else wants to. So with that being said, wherever you are, stay safe, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.